I am who I think you think I am. Take a moment to consider those words. I am who I think you think I am. I'd never really looked at the concept of identity from this perspective, at least not consciously, but I must have done it at some point, because as soon as I heard the phrase, something clicked. There's a ringing truth to the words of Thomas Cooley, the man who came up with the phrase. This is a truth that we've probably known all our lives, but have never really noticed until now. So what I want to talk to all of you about today is a familiar topic, identity. However, don't be fooled, because the relative familiarity of such a topic does not by any means make it less difficult to deal with. Identity is such a gray concept that there's really no black and white way of determining what shapes us into the humans that we are today. But I do know one thing. Our identities are determined as much by who we think we are as by who we believe other people think we are. But here's the thing. Our interactions with reality are not simply reflections of what's out there. All of us do not experience things the same way, we do not react the same way to the same things, and nor are we affected the same way by the same things. Therefore, our perception of the world is heavily influenced by context, cultures, and experiences. But most importantly, they're influenced by these almost unconscious human tendencies to look for information that matches our preconceived notions. And that's where the influence of the people around us comes in. Because these tendencies, these expectations, can affect a lot more than the person harboring them. They can also affect the person about whom they are, and this can often lead to something called a self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you here have heard of what a self-fulfilling prophecy is? Wow, that's actually a good number, but for the sake of formality, a self-fulfilling prophecy is a type of confirmation bias. Let's break that down a little more. A confirmation bias is a situation in which, more or less, you choose to accept and assimilate information that matches your preconceived notions, rather than to open up your mind to information that challenges them. Basically, what our mind is doing is it's going through this unconscious process of sorting through new information and trying to match it to information that is already stored. What it doesn't do is give a leeway for the information that can't be sorted. Famous cognitive psychologist Bartlett actually demonstrated something similar with memory, that rather than being replicative, memory was reconstructive. What he meant was that the information that we obtain from the world goes through a categorization process. And when we try to obtain that from our memory, it's already been subject to certain changes, certain distortions, due to that very process. So therefore the memory is reconstructed, it's not replicated. We can apply a similar principle here. Think of our mind as a filing cabinet. We have different files with different information and different labels, and each file corresponds to a different type of information. We have files for our personal work and for our formal work. We have files for different subjects like science and English, and we have files for our favorite books, movies, TV shows, you know the lot. We could also have files for the different people in our life. There is really no end to the way we can divide those files, but they definitely exist. So when we experience something, our mind is trying to sort that experience and the information that we get from that experience into one of the constituent files. But what happens when we run into information that we can't sort? Or the information itself doesn't correspond to the file that it's been assigned to? This can cause a bit of a dilemma for our mind, because all it really wants to do is reach a state of equilibrium, a state of balance, and when information doesn't match, this is a bit of a problem. So how does it overcome that? What's our mind going to do? It changes the information, it alters it. And what happens is gradually this leads to a change in our mindset, a change in the very assumptions that we live with every single day of our lives. Eventually, these changes become such an integral part of us, these assumptions become such an integral part of us, that we don't even question it. So let's extend that to what I've been talking about so far. I just explained confirmation biases, and self-fulfilling prophecies are a subset of that. So a self-fulfilling prophecy is a situation in which you start out with a false claim, and that causes a change in behavior, which causes the previously false claim to come true. It's a bit of a roundabout process, but that's essentially the gist of it. But we have to ask ourselves why these claims exist in the first place. Usually we'd attribute it to the presence of assumptions and biases in the mind of the person with it. But when these start to affect the people around us, that's when the real problem arises. Now, in 1978, researchers Snyder and Swan from the University of Minnesota conducted a series of experiments to demonstrate how people's social expectations led them to act in a way that caused others to actually confirm those expectations. You'll see in a minute exactly why I chose this study, because this one really drives the point home. Now, the study itself involved students from the University of Minnesota. They were the participants, and they were divided into pairs. Each pair was given a noise generator, which they could use in turns. The noise generator could deliver varying degrees of noise. Now, this wasn't good noise. This was bad, harsh, lawnmower level noise. So the purpose of the noise generator, you ask, is to convey dislike to the other participant without explicitly putting it into words. So if one participant heard the noise, it could be assumed that there was some tension within the pairs. But what the students didn't know was that the researchers gave some participants extra information. Some participants were told that their partner was going to be aggressive and disagreeable, while others were told that they were going to be cooperative and easygoing. Now, these expectations were completely assigned at random. There was no founded reason for these expectations. So it's really interesting to see the kind of effects that it had. In situations where partners were expecting an aggressive and disagreeable student, the noise used from the noise generator was significantly more intense than in situations where people were expecting a cooperative partner. So if student 1 thought student 2 was aggressive, student 1 that would affect his interaction, and student 2 would perceive that interaction and end up responding aggressively, thus confirming student 1's initial unfounded bias that student 2 is indeed aggressive. A self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, this was seen in 61% of the cases, so that's a really significant number. We can't just dismiss 61%. But what's even more interesting is that even after the student who had the expectation, the student interviewer, was removed from the equation, the other student who was responding to the expectation continued to show signs of that expected behavior. So if student 1 thought student 2 was aggressive, when student 1 was removed from the equation and student 3 was brought in with a blank slate, no expectations, no assumptions whatsoever, student 2 continued to rise to the expectation. Now, just think about what that means for a minute. What is this study implying? It's showing us just how much of an effect a simple belief can create, that the kinds of expectations that people have of us can continue to remain present and exert influence even after they're no longer in the picture. Now, the problem is that once these expectations and assumptions are set, it becomes difficult to separate them, and sometimes they might just end up becoming true. In fact, research has shown that the judgments and assumptions made within the first few minutes of meeting someone are to a good extent accurate. So how are we supposed to deal with this? What I'm really getting at here is the implications that this has in real life. It's always been difficult for us to separate the identity that others have created for us from what we want to create for ourselves. And it seems like now more than ever, this proves to be an unclimbable mountain. On a more personal note myself, as a teenager, the concept of identity is something that I've always struggled with. Throwing in the idea of confirmation biases and self-fulfilling prophecies just seems to add to this ever-complicated mix of teen angst and indecisiveness. The thing is, we've all been subject to these biases before, and at times we've allowed them to dictate our self-worth more than we should. We've allowed others' expectations to guide how we act, and we've become so caught up in this misconceived image of ourselves that we've forgotten that I am not who I think you think I am. Rather, I am who I want you to think I am. So that's the question. Who do you want to be? How do you want to be defined? Do you want to be defined by your strengths, the extracurriculars you excel in, or the emotions you're well known to exhibit? Or do you want to be defined by your weaknesses, your past, or better yet, the future that you want to create for yourself? These are all big questions, and by no means are they easy to answer. In fact, it's completely all right to not know the answer because there's something rather attractive about the flexibility of not knowing. We don't need to know what we want to be defined by, but we should know what we don't want to be defined by. Because once that comes into the clear, we're a step closer to identifying and freeing ourselves from the biases of other people. No doubt, recognizing these biases in real life is difficult, and acting to change them is even more so. But it's important to realize and remember that, as with anything, judgments, assumptions, biases, they're all subject to alterations. It's hard to find a balance between being who we want to be and realizing that by living in a society, we have to give some sort of consideration to the opinions of others. The truth of the matter is that we'll always be at a metaphorical impasse between trying to decide which version of ourselves we want to be. Sometimes we're going to know the answer, and sometimes we're not going to know the answer. But that's all right, because once we accept that fact, we can figure out our own way to stand out despite this ever-present need for social conformity. So when you're in doubt, I'm going to leave you with the words of Dr. Seuss. You're on your own, and you know what you know, and you are the one who'll decide where to go. Thank you.